You're listening to Level Up with Melissa Zeloof from Iron Source.
Welcome back, everyone. You're listening to Level Up, the podcast for people who love making, growing, and of course, playing mobile games. I'm your host, Melissa Zeloof, and this is the third episode in our series for indie developers called What I Wish I Knew When. Joining me on today's podcast is Simon Davis, who's originally from the UK but currently located in Singapore. Simon is the CEO and co-founder of Mighty Bear Games, the venture-backed developer behind the hit game Royale. And we're going to be talking about what he wishes he knew earlier on in his career when evaluating ideas for new games and how to identify potential hits. Simon, thanks very much for being on the show today.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So to start with, perhaps you could tell us a little bit about your journey in the gaming industry and how you ended up starting Mighty Bear.
Sure, yeah. So like most people in the games industry, I kind of landed in it by accident. So I was actually originally a music graduate and I was a working musician down in Brighton. So I was teaching guitar, I was playing in bands, doing kind of just trying to make a living from playing my guitar. And like most musicians, I was pretty broke a lot of the time. Mm-hmm. So I'm lucky enough that I grew up in a bilingual family. And one summer I got a summer job doing localization. Although I actually applied for localization, I ended up doing QA. And so I started actually in the industry at the very bottom about, I want to say close to 17 years ago. And, you know, from that QA went into design and production, product management, being a senior product lead, moving from console to free to play. I was there during that transition in around the late 2000s, early 2010s, and then eventually kind of, you know, moving into mobile and today kind of founding Mighty Bear. But, you know, that journey's taken me through everything from outsourcing, which is where I started, to publisher side, developer side, and then working at big companies like Ubisoft and Big Point and doing, you know, external projects for some of the biggest companies in the industry. So it's been a very interesting journey.
Mm-hmm. What was the second language?
Oh, sorry, I should have mentioned. Yeah, my mother is actually Spanish, so we spoke Spanish at home.
Handy.
Yeah.
Very cool. And how, let's talk a little bit about Royale. How did you come up with the concept and the mechanics there? Were you sort of looking to make a Battle Royale style game, or did it sort of happen serendipitously?
No, I mean, it wasn't something we explicitly set out to do. So as a studio, we have a whole focus on what we call accessible multiplayer. And so that's our thing. Like we tackle multiplayer games that may kind of genres and ideas that may have been established elsewhere, but haven't really reached like a mainstream audience. And that's something we think is really interesting. So Mario Kart is a classic example of this kind of thinking where you take racing games which are traditionally not that accessible and you create an experience which is very deep, but like anyone can pick up. So within the team, we encourage people to come up with ideas for concepts all the time and put them forward and evaluate them. There was one concept in the team which we didn't run with, which was called Royale. And it was very hardcore. And that's the reason we didn't do it, basically. But at that point, it kind of, you know, the germ of the idea came in as some kind of Royale idea with food. And then basically Apple approached us, to ask if we had any ideas for titles for Apple Arcade. And we went back to our idea bank because we had a very kind of short time frame to make the game in. I mean, the game was made in 6 months. And we were looking at Calamari Royale. And then I was like, well, actually, what if we did, but like the game started actually with a pun. And then we fleshed out the concept and it was evaluated against 7 or 8 other concepts, and we realized actually it was one that we could execute within the time frame, which was obviously like essential in the decision-making process, but also was really fun and actually hit a lot of the other marks that we had as a studio. So the initial concept was a bit more wacky than what we have now, but it was, I'd say 99% there or 95% there.
Nice. So that's a nice segue to talking about our main focus, which is how we want to pick your brain, essentially, and your experience on how to come up with new game ideas that succeed and evaluating, being able to tell, right, which ones are going to be the next big hit and which ones aren't. So to start, let's begin with the fundamental question. How do you come up with game ideas? How do you sort of I mean, I've lots of sub questions here, but I'm going to leave this high level and open for now.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, right? It's like, how do you write a song or write a story? I think the easiest way, and it sounds so trite, right, is to just start and encourage the team to start getting into the habit of writing down their ideas and kind of showing them what good looks like in terms of like a high level game pitch. So we have a format we use for that. Just like 3 bullet points, maybe a mock-up screenshot, and then like a tagline and a name, and try and sell the idea. And if you can convey the idea within that format, then you already kind of have the germ of something. But I think really developing that muscle and that practice, because a lot of people just go off and build the first thing they think of, or something they think is like really cool, and they don't consider other options. And so we encourage the team to do that a lot, actually. And I think that's a big part of how we approach the problem. But the other thing is just having a clear framework. So again, like we mentioned accessible multiplayer earlier, like the team has that framework that we've evolved over time. It has changed, but they know what the criteria are and what we value and what we don't value. And that already kind of steers things kind of in the right direction as well. It does mean that some ideas will never get brought to us that could maybe be, really good, but I'm okay with that, because I would rather that, given that we're so small, that we focus on kind of specific areas of specialism and become experts at those, rather than try and do, I don't know, like 100-hour narrative RPG type game. It just makes no sense for us.
And when it comes to, you've talked about being about specificity, but let's say you're sort of not an average, you're a game developer, you're not currently working for Mighty Bear. Should you look to really innovate and reinvent the wheel, or is it safer to put a spin on a tried and tested concept that's already succeeding in the market? Or is there a case for both?
I'd actually say there's a case for both. So, some companies are design-led. I think Apple is a, fantastic example of that, right? They don't really, you look at other companies that do a lot of A/B testing, a lot of focus group type tests. Like, that's not how you build like really innovative products, like the first iPhone, for example, right? And it's the same with game studios. Some game studios have that capability and that kind of approach, and they have the right personnel for that, and it totally makes sense. And other people are much stronger on the data side, right? And very good at iterating and kind of finding something that really works. So, there is definitely like a big risk in doing something completely different. So especially if you're doing your own publishing, right? From a marketing and UA perspective, there's going to be a lot of unknowns there if you do something that's completely new. And presumably there'll be a lack of expertise from within the team, both from a product and publishing perspective. And then, if I was playing devil's advocate, I'd say if you look at probably the two most successful games on desktop today, which are both League of Legends and Fortnite, they're essentially iterative, right? Fortnite builds on the other Royale games that came before it, and League of Legends obviously follows on from what Dota did as well. So I think, historically the games have been the biggest hits have been improvements on existing formulas. But, if you can land on a winning formula from the off, then you have this amazing blue ocean open to just yourself. It's a huge opportunity.
And what about understanding and identifying market opportunities? Do you guys use market analysis services like App Annie, for example? And if so, what are you looking at? Because there's a lot on that platform. So which metrics would you be looking at?
We do use services like that. I'm not gonna give anyone free advertising and say which one we use. But from the off, I'm not sure that this is like the right approach to start with. So I think it's healthy to have a strong thesis as a studio. So you really sit down, you think about what it is that your studio is good at doing, taking to mind the team you have, their strengths, their interests, and where it aligns. So, for example, our first game actually was we did actually the approach that you just described now. So we looked at the market and we say, hey, MMOs have this amazing long-term retention with the players who stay beyond the first couple of weeks. They monetize very well. There's this huge opportunity for like a casual MMO. And there's a number of reasons that game didn't really work out for us. But one of the ones, if I'm totally honest, is because the team just didn't have the level of enthusiasm for the genre and the content we were building that they did for other genres. I think you have to be really honest about what you can do as a studio and where people's interests lie, because someone that really loves a concept like we have with Battle Royale now, the quality of the work is very different. Even if people do their best, like you can really feel the love when you pick up a game and then you can see the team is really passionate about it. But so only at the point where we have a thesis do we start looking at like games and genres on these service to identify kind of spaces where we think there might be an opportunity to do our own thing. So with accessible multiplayer, for example, like there's a couple of concepts we have within the studio which are not shooters, but they do fit the team's interests, and we have gone in there and we've looked at things like retention, CPI, RPI. So that's, sorry, I shouldn't use acronyms. Cost per install and revenue per install for these. You never know, right? For these different games, and try and identify where we think like there's an underserved market or an opportunity that maybe for the bigger companies, the Zingers and the Supercells and whatever of this world, it's not really worth their time. But for someone like us, like a game that makes, I don't know, 10 to 50 to $100 million a year is still a very good business.
For sure. And what are the kinds of activities you talked about, setting a framework, but what are some of the activities you do at Mighty Bear to come up with ideas?
Yeah, so I know a lot of people do things like hackathons and like workshops and stuff. I'm generally not a fan of them. I feel they're a bit like forced fun. So it's like you're telling people to be creative for a day and then like go back to their desk. So one of the things we try and encourage is to have that kind of mindset all the time. So, I worked for large companies for years, and I'm sure there are exceptions, but I've been to many hackathons and I'm yet to see one of them that actually delivered a game that launched. We do occasionally, like, for example, we had, without being too specific, we had basically the owner of a very large franchise come to us and say, hey, like, would you like to make a game based on this? And then we went away and we were like, okay. And we dissected it as like a group of people. And then within our Mighty Bear framework, what works, what doesn't work. And then we sent people away to come up with some ideas over the course of like a week. But we let people go and do that in their own time and give them the framework, but then they have the time and the kind of space to allow those ideas to gestate, and then they put them within the kind of template. So everyone is delivering stuff that looks roughly comparable so that you can actually compare different ideas as well. But I think for us, it's the challenge is to get people doing this like in a constant state and constantly delivering new ideas and improvements to our games rather than trying to mandate when people get to be creative.
That makes sense. Contrary to popular wisdom, and once you have that set of comparable game concepts, and it's time to evaluate which has the most potential, what's the criteria that you're looking at that helps you identify what makes a winning game or a winning concept, let's say? What are those considerations, and does that differ right from studio to studio?
Yeah, I think it does differ from studio to studio for sure. So like the framework that we've come up with, like that spreadsheet was an example of it. And I didn't share everything that we use because it's just very specific to us. But a lot of it's based on postmortems from other games where we analyze what didn't work, but also what did work and what really resonates. So one of the criteria we have now is like when we describe Battle Royale, we'd say how like basically a Royale game with food where you shoot people with food until they pass out, and people always like smile or laugh at that. So one of the criteria is like, if we describe the game, can we make people laugh? And like humor is like one of the most important things now that determines whether we do a game, because it's actually helped the game a lot. Just with reach and with the level of engagement from some of the members of the community and marketing, like Apple have done this amazing push behind the game. And I think that all played a huge part of it. And then other things we look at, which I think are kind of more relevant to everyone, are things like the team strengths, which I was talking about, and skills. So if you have guys on your team who don't have any back-end experience, then maybe building an MMO is not such a great idea. And like people being very honest and also looking at the kind of technical solutions that they could use to fill those gaps. I mentioned it before, but really never underestimate the importance of enthusiasm on your team as well, and like what genres people love. Obviously, the job is not to make games for yourself, right? It's to make games for your audience. But that you should at least keep in mind like the kind of games that could get people on the team excited or happy to work on. Relevant titles shipped. So if someone has shipped shooters or racing games before, then the likelihood is that they're going to be, very good at kind of those games. They're going to have the right kind of background. Also, like what kind of UA pipeline do you have in your studio? Like, is your community really set up? For example, can you cross promote from one community to the game that you're working on? Like, there's a lot of different stuff. I think the most important one, though, which is undervalued a lot when people think of the next cool creative idea they want to make, is time to market versus resources. So we have a hard rule, like we don't develop any games that we self-fund, which can't go to beta within 6 months. And people say that sounds very aggressive, but it's a great way of being really focused and making sure that you have like a very strong MVP without any kind of superfluous features when you start collating data.
That sounds very wise. This is actually, I think, a really interesting question. What are the dangers of bias? Which is like the toughest thing to tackle
Yeah.
because a lot of the time you're unaware. But when you're tackling the process of greenlighting a game, um, is bias an issue first of all? Because you know what, it exists, but maybe it's not. It's not necessarily a bad thing. And have there been times in your experience where you've had to sort of catch yourself from getting carried away by an idea that you really want to succeed, but wasn't sort of hitting some of the criteria you've described, which is obviously complicated by the fact that you've said, you know, from your perspective, team enthusiasm, right, and love for the concept is a big part of what drives success.
Yeah, that is true, but I would say that different people on the team are enthusiastic about different things. So generally, that's less of an issue. Now, having said that, bias is real. One of the challenges we've had as a company is that not everyone is great at being objective about their own ideas, right? And it's something that everyone has to work on, some more than others. And there are certain people who we've had to really invest a lot of time on that. And I think that when you have a live game and maybe the numbers are not conclusive one way or another, that's a very dangerous trap. You know, I have a very good investor friend. I'll name drop him. Henrik from Play Ventures is always talking about how every game studio he talks about is always says, "Oh, it'll be the next update, that fixes things," and it never is. Like that's a big trap. And basically, you know, studios can die because they spend, you know, a year or 2 or 3 years even trying to turn around a game which has like below average metrics and is not really kind of savable. So one of the things we realized from our first game actually was to really work around this. We released an MMO, and we spent 18 months on it with 8 guys, which was not an experience I'd like to repeat, building an MMO with 8 people. But really, like, if I'm brutally honest, like we probably could have killed it slightly earlier. I would say it was a good learning experience for the studio. But I think once you've greenlit a game and the game's gone live, there's also, you have to be very kind of aggressive with knowing when to cut it. Because we still cut it where we still had, you know, over a year's worth of runway, and now the studio's in a very different position. We cut early enough, but I've seen lots of studios die because they didn't have the courage to kill their baby, right?
Wow. Yes, that's very accurate and morbid. I want to. So we've talked about a lot of really interesting things, but I want to use Butter Royale ideally as a way of making all of this concrete for our listeners. So, what can you tell us about how you applied Mighty Bear's framework to Butter Royale to know, yes, this is a winning concept. Let's move forward.
Yeah, I mean, it was pretty straightforward. So we had 5 or 6 games that we thought could be candidates for the Apple Arcade project. We put them into the framework. We sat down. There was a group of like 8, 9 people in the room to really sanity check the numbers that were being put in. So you know, you might score one category 3 out of 5, 4 out of 5, and then everyone would we have a big culture of dissent. Everyone would openly challenge if they strongly disagreed, and there would be some kind of consensus around what the values would be. And by the end of that, we kind of got to 2 games. We presented these to Apple, and they really liked both of them. So at that point, we had to go away and decide whether we were going to make one game or another. And they had kind of roughly equivalent scores within the sheet. And then at that point, we really had to sit down and have a very frank discussion with the team and really gauge like which one of the 2 they would be kind of most excited to do, and they felt they could do the best kind of level of execution on. So we used the framework initially just to eliminate kind of 4 different concepts till we just had a couple left. But the framework that we use is actually an extended version of the sheet that I shared. And we basically spent an afternoon scoring like 5, 6 different games out of like, you know, 20, 30 different criteria. And at every point, like really debating and digging into the assumptions of kind of every score. So kind of everyone had done their homework ahead of time.
Mm-hmm. And what are some of the most common mistakes or misconceptions you see from developers when it comes to identifying a good game concept?
Yeah, well, I mean, the most obvious one is that I like it, therefore it must be good, right? And you see this like feeding into the scores they give stuff, and you'll be like, okay, what is the I don't know is this likely to retain like very well, for example? And they'll say yes, and you'll be like, okay, well, let's look at the data for comparable games in the market. And then you look at like the top performing games in that genre, they won't retain. Like, it's people like, there's a lot of assumptions and people basically not backing it up with data. I would say it's probably the most common thing. And you don't have to use something like App Annie to get that data. A lot of time it can also just be research online about how comparable titles are doing, but a lot of people won't do that. They'll just, I guess, just off what they believe to be true, they'll just fill in these values rather than really spending the time to really consider the kind of correct weighting they should be giving things and kind of scores they should be giving them.
Mm-hmm. Last question. If you could go back in time and tell, I don't know why we've chosen 25 years old, right? You could have been 17, but tell a younger Simon Davis, who's trying to start his own mobile game studio, the most important thing about identifying and evaluating new game concepts. So basically, summarize in very short sentences the last 20 minutes. What would that one thing be?
Build a framework to try and eliminate bias. So when you have everything written with numbers, it's very stark. Don't blindly follow the market opportunity, and don't try and build an MMO with 8 people.
That was great. Thank you, Simon, for sharing your insight.
My pleasure.
Really, really interesting episode. And thank you to everyone else, as always, for listening.